The diner was alive with the low hum of conversation, forks clinking against plates, and the occasional hiss of the coffee machine behind the counter. Clint Eastwood sat alone at a corner booth, his iconic silhouette unmistakable even to those who were too young to have seen his films. He wasn't trying to draw attention to himself, but his quiet presence commanded it nonetheless. The coffee in front of him was untouched, steam curling lazily into the air as he stared out the frosted window at the falling snow. The front door swung open with a loud creak, and a biting gust of wind swept into the diner, sending napkins fluttering off tables. Heads turned as a man shuffled inside, his clothes tattered and soaked, his face smeared with dirt. He hesitated in the doorway, his hunched shoulders and trembling hands betraying his discomfort. The room seemed to grow quieter, the cheerful hum of chatter replaced by an uneasy silence as the man stepped forward. "Excuse me." His voice cracked, barely audible over the soft murmurs of the diner. "Can someone spare $1? Just $1. I need something to eat." The man's words hung in the air like the frost on the windows, fragile and heavy. He scanned the room, his pleading eyes meeting faces that quickly looked away. Customers buried their attention in their plates. Others glanced nervously at their companions. He spotted Clint, sitting quietly in his corner, and his eyes lit up with recognition. "You," the man said, taking a tentative step closer. "You're Clint Eastwood." Clint didn't respond immediately. He slowly lifted his gaze, his sharp blue eyes locking onto the man with a steady intensity that could silence a room. The homeless man faltered, but he pressed on, his voice growing firmer with each word. "Please, I just need $1. That's all. $1 for some food." The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. All eyes were now on Clint, waiting to see how the legendary figure would respond. The air was so still, the faint buzz of a fluorescent light above the counter sounded deafening. Clint leaned back in his booth, his expression unreadable. His hand moved to his coffee cup, lifting it slowly to his lips as if considering the man's request. He took a long sip before setting the cup back down, his piercing gaze never leaving the man. "Why should I?" he said finally, his voice calm but cold, each word carrying the weight of a challenge. "What makes you think you've earned it?" The man's jaw tightened, his initial desperation morphing into frustration. "Earned it?" he repeated, his voice rising. "I'm freezing. I haven't eaten in 2 days. You've got millions, and you're telling me I have to earn $1. Clint's gaze didn't waver. "Life's tough," he said simply. "No one's gonna hand you anything." The man's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But instead, he let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You're just like the rest of them," he muttered. "Pretend to care in the movies, but when it comes down to it, you're just another rich guy who doesn't give a damn." The staff began to move toward the man, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating scene. A waitress whispered something to the manager, who nodded and approached. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," the manager said, his tone firm but uneasy. The homeless man didn't resist as he was gently guided toward the door. Before stepping out into the snow, he turned back one last time, his voice echoing through the silent diner. "You'll regret this, Eastwood. You'll see." As the door slammed shut behind him, the room remained still. Conversations didn't resume, forks didn't clink. The customers exchanged uneasy glances, and a faint buzz of judgment seemed to hang in the air, directed toward the man who had just refused to help. Clint, however, remained unbothered. He picked up his coffee again, took another sip, and returned his gaze to the window, as though nothing had happened. The diner slowly returned to its rhythm, though the buzz of conversation was now colored with whispers about Clint Eastwood. Some patrons muttered their disapproval, while others shrugged, defending his choice. A man at the counter leaned toward the waitress and said, "That homeless guy had no right to bother Clint. You can't just walk up to a guy like that and expect a handout." Across the room, a young couple exchanged glances, the woman shaking her head. I can't believe he couldn't even spare $1. He's got millions. Clint, seemingly immune to the quiet judgment in the room, finished his coffee and stood up. He left a crisp bill on the table, more than enough to cover his meal, and adjusted his hat before heading for the door. As he stepped outside, the cold winter air bit at his face, the snow falling steadily now, crunching under his boots as he walked. Across the street, he saw the homeless man again, huddled against a brick wall, his tattered blanket barely protecting him from the elements. Clint paused for a moment, his hand brushing the brim of his hat as if in thought. Then, without a word, he turned and walked the other way. That night, the video of the diner encounter exploded on social media. The clip, only a few seconds long, showed Clint's icy response to the homeless man's plea. The caption read, "Clint Eastwood refuses to help a homeless man. Hollywood hypocrisy at its finest." It spread like wildfire, with millions of views and thousands of comments pouring in within hours. The reactions were as divided as they were passionate. Some called Clint heartless, accusing him of being out of touch with the struggles of ordinary people. How hard is it to give $1? One comment read, "He's just another rich guy who thinks he's better than everyone else." Others, however, defended him fiercely. "He's not wrong," another user argued. "Life doesn't hand you anything. You've got to work for it." Maybe this was tough love. As the controversy raged online, Clint remained silent. He didn't issue a statement, didn't post on social media, and didn't acknowledge the growing storm of opinion surrounding him. For Clint, it was just another day. But for the homeless man, it was anything but. The video had made him an unwitting symbol of the ongoing debate about wealth, responsibility, and the struggles of the less fortunate. Reporters began searching for him, eager to hear his side of the story. Meanwhile, the public demanded answers, not just from Clint, but from the man himself. 2 days later, a local news station tracked the homeless man down. He was sitting on the same bench near the diner, the tattered blanket still wrapped around him. When asked about the encounter, he didn't hold back. "What Clint Eastwood did was wrong," he said, his voice filled with bitterness. "How hard is it to show a little kindness? I wasn't asking for much. Just $1. As the interview aired, it reignited the controversy, sparking even more heated debates. Some saw the man as a victim of society's indifference, while others criticized him for expecting charity instead of seeking opportunities to help himself. Back in his home, Clint watched the segment in silence. His expression remained stoic, unreadable, as the homeless man's words played on the screen. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't call his agent, and didn't bother reading the endless stream of articles dissecting his actions. Instead, he turned off the television, grabbed his coat, and stepped outside into the cold. The snow was still falling as Clint climbed into his truck, the engine roaring to life. He drove toward town, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He wasn't heading back to the diner. He had a different destination in mind. Clint drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound accompanying him through the snow-covered streets. The headlights of his truck cut through the falling flakes, illuminating the quiet town. As he reached the outskirts, his destination came into view, a small rundown shelter with flickering lights and a sign that read, "Community Haven." He parked the truck and sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his expression unreadable. Inside, the shelter was dimly lit, bustling with the quiet chaos of volunteers, serving hot meals and finding warm blankets for the people who had sought refuge from the cold. Clint walked in, his presence instantly noticed. A volunteer, a woman in her 50s with a tired but kind face, approached him cautiously. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "What brings you here?" Clint removed his hat, nodding toward the people gathered in the corner of the room. "Looking for someone." It didn't take long to find him. The homeless man from the diner was sitting at a table, hunched over a steaming cup of soup. His blanket, still as tattered as before, was draped over his shoulders. Clint walked over, his boots clicking softly against the floor. The man looked up, his expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. "You again," the man said, his tone laced with bitterness. "Come to lecture me some more?" Clint didn't answer right away. He pulled out a chair and sat across from him, placing his hat on the table. "You want to talk, or you want to keep feeling sorry for yourself?" The man blinked, stunned by the bluntness of Clint's words. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice shaking. "I saw the news," Clint said, his voice steady. "You're out there telling the world I'm the bad guy. You think that's going to fix your problems?" The man's face flushed. "You think I asked for this? I didn't tell anyone to record us. I just wanted a little help." Clint leaned forward, his piercing gaze locking onto the man's. "You didn't ask for the cameras, but you've got their attention now. Question is, what are you going to do with it?" The man stared at him, unsure how to respond. Clint reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table. "This is the address of a friend of mine. He runs a construction company. They're always looking for workers. Show up tomorrow morning, and you'll have a shot." The man looked at the paper, then back at Clint. "Why would you do this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Clint stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Because everyone deserves a second chance, but it's up to you to take it." As Clint turned to leave, the man called after him. "What if I don't show up?" Clint paused, glancing over his shoulder. "Then that's your choice. But don't expect me to feel sorry for you." The room was silent as Clint walked out, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing through the shelter. The man stared at the piece of paper in his hand, his thoughts racing as the snow continued to fall outside. Clint stepped out into the cold night, pulling his coat tighter against the biting wind. The shelter's glow faded behind him as he climbed into his truck and drove off. Inside, the homeless man remained frozen in place, the folded piece of paper resting in his trembling hands. He stared at it, the address scrawled neatly in bold letters, and felt an unfamiliar sensation stirring within him, something between hope and fear. The room buzzed quietly with the shuffle of volunteers and murmured conversations, but he barely noticed. One of the shelter workers approached, a steaming cup of tea in hand. "You okay?" she asked softly. He looked up at her, his voice raw. "Do you think someone like me can really start over?" The worker smiled gently, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's never too late, but the first step is always the hardest. You've got to believe it's possible." The man glanced down at the address again, his thoughts racing. Every instinct screamed at him to crumple the paper, to throw it away and bury himself deeper in the familiar safety of hopelessness. But Clint's words echoed in his mind. "It's up to you to take it." That night he didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his cot in the corner of the shelter, replaying the scene at the diner, the humiliation, and the offer Clint had extended. Morning came too quickly, the weak winter sun barely piercing the thick blanket of clouds. Volunteers bustled around, handing out breakfast and warm clothing, but the man remained in his corner, staring at the paper as if it held all the answers he needed. Finally, as the clock struck 7, he stood. His legs felt shaky, but he forced himself to move. Borrowing a threadbare scarf from the shelter's donation box, he stepped out into the frigid morning. The construction company was on the other side of town, and the journey on foot through the snow-covered streets felt endless. His breath formed thick clouds in the air as he trudged forward, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. When he finally reached the address, he hesitated. The building was unassuming, with trucks and machinery parked outside. Workers in heavy coats moved briskly, shouting instructions and hauling equipment. He felt out of place, painfully aware of his ragged appearance, but he swallowed his fear and approached the office door. Inside, a receptionist looked up, startled by his presence. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. He pulled out the crumpled piece of paper and slid it across the counter. "Clint Eastwood told me to come here," he said, his voice barely steady. The receptionist's eyebrows shot up, but she didn't question it. Instead, she picked up the phone and made a quick call. Minutes later, a burly man with a clipboard and a no-nonsense expression appeared. He sized up the newcomer, his eyes lingering on the tattered clothing and worn-out shoes. "Eastwood sent you, huh?" the man said, his voice gruff. "Well, if he vouches for you, I guess we'll see what you've got. You start today." The homeless man's eyes widened. "Just like that?" The man shrugged. "This isn't charity. You'll work hard or you're out. Understand?" He nodded quickly, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, he felt the faint flicker of possibility. The day began without ceremony. The foreman, whose name was Mike, handed the man a pair of heavy work gloves and pointed him toward a crew unloading wooden beams from a truck. "Start there," he said gruffly, "and don't slow the others down." The homeless man nodded, though his legs felt shaky and his hands were already stiff from the cold. The crew barely glanced at him as he joined them, their focus on the job at hand. He grabbed one end of a beam and immediately felt the weight pull at his already weary body. Gritting his teeth, he hoisted it up and followed the others toward the construction site. Hours passed in a blur of lifting, carrying, and hammering. The man's muscles burned, his breath fogging the icy air, but he didn't stop. Every time he faltered, Clint's words echoed in his mind. "No one's gonna hand you anything." During a short break, one of the workers, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard, handed him a thermos. "Here," he said, his tone softer than expected. "Coffee." The man hesitated, then accepted it with a quiet thanks. He took a sip, the warmth spreading through his chest like a small reprieve from the cold. The worker studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You're new, huh? Eastwood sent you?" The man nodded, unsure of how much to say. "Yeah. He gave me a chance." The worker let out a low whistle. "That guy doesn't hand out chances lightly. If he sees something in you, don't waste it." The man didn't reply, but the words settled into his mind. As the break ended and the crew returned to work, he pushed himself harder, determined not to let Clint or himself down. By the end of the day, his body ached in ways he hadn't thought possible. His hands were raw despite the gloves. His back screamed with every step, but he felt something he hadn't in years. Pride. He had worked, earned his place, and for the first time, he didn't feel invisible. When he returned to the shelter that evening, he collapsed onto his cot, utterly exhausted. A volunteer noticed his worn-out state and brought him a hot bowl of soup. "You look like you've had quite the day," she said with a kind smile. He nodded, too tired to respond, but inside, he felt a flicker of hope growing stronger. The piece of paper Clint had given him wasn't just an address, it was a lifeline. Meanwhile, the internet was still ablaze with debates about Clint Eastwood's actions. Headlines ranged from "Hollywood star turns his back on the homeless" to "Clint Eastwood's tough love approach sparks national debate." TV pundits argued about the morality of his response, while social media users shared their own stories of struggle and second chances. Clint, however, remained as silent as ever. He didn't care for the noise, the headlines, or the endless opinions. For him, the only thing that mattered was whether the man would show up and seize the opportunity he'd been given. As the days turned into weeks, the homeless man whose name he eventually shared was Eddie continued to show up to the construction site. His first few days were brutal. His body screamed in protest, and he struggled to keep pace with the other workers. But Eddie refused to quit. Every morning, before dawn, he dragged himself out of the shelter and braved the cold to get to the site on time. The crew slowly began to warm to him. At first, they barely acknowledged his presence, but as they saw his determination and grit, they started to treat him as one of their own. Mike, the foreman, kept his gruff demeanor but occasionally offered Eddie a nod of approval or a few words of encouragement. One particularly cold morning, Mike called Eddie over. "You've been doing solid work," he said, his tone reluctant but genuine. There's a spot on the crew if you want it. Full-time. Eddie blinked, stunned. You mean I'm hired? Mike shrugged, scratching his beard. If you keep this up, yeah. But don't think I'm gonna go easy on you. Eddie smiled, the first real smile he'd allowed himself in years. I won't let you down. Meanwhile, the controversy surrounding Clint Eastwood refused to die down. News outlets continued to dissect his diner encounter, with some labeling him heartless and others hailing him as a symbol of old-school values. The clip of the incident had been replayed millions of times, but the new footage of Eddie at work began to emerge as well. A local reporter had caught wind of his story and interviewed the crew, who spoke about Eddie's transformation and Clint's behind-the-scenes role in giving him a chance. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. Headlines began to change. Eastwood's tough love pays off, and homeless man rebuilds his life thanks to Clint Eastwood. But Clint, true to form, refused to comment. When approached by reporters outside his home, he simply waved them off with a gruff, "I did what anyone should have done." Eddie's story, however, captured the public's imagination. Donations began pouring into the shelter that had housed him, along with job offers for other residents. Eddie, though, was determined to stick with the construction job. "This is where I proved I could do it," he told a reporter. "I'm not leaving." "Not bad, kid," he said, his voice carrying the same no-nonsense tone as always. "Figured you'd quit by now." Eddie grinned, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I thought about it, but I couldn't let you be right." Clint smirked, tipping his hat slightly. "Good, keep it that way." He turned to leave, but Eddie called after him. "Hey, thanks. For everything." Clint paused, glancing back over his shoulder. "Don't thank me, you earned it." As Clint walked away, Eddie stood there, the weight of those words settling in. For the first time in years, he felt not just hopeful but proud. He had taken the chance Clint had offered, and he wasn't looking back. Months passed, and Eddie's life continued to take shape. He had secured a full-time position at the construction company, earned the respect of his co-workers, and even started saving money for the future. His once gaunt frame filled out with the strength of daily labor, and the weariness in his eyes was replaced by determination. The apartment he moved into was small, but to Eddie, it was a palace. Every creak of the floorboards and chipped piece of paint felt like a reminder of how far he had come. The media frenzy around Clint Eastwood's encounter at the diner had long since faded, replaced by the next viral story. But for Eddie, that moment remained etched in his memory, not as a source of shame, but as the turning point of his life. Each time he walked past the diner, he found himself pausing, staring at the place where it all began. One evening, after finishing a particularly grueling shift, Eddie decided to stop by the diner. The familiar smell of coffee and grilled food hit him as he stepped inside. The same waitress who had been working that day looked up and smiled. "Well, look at you," she said warmly. "It's been a while." Eddie grinned, his face lighting up. "Yeah, a lot's changed." She poured him a fresh cup of coffee without asking, just like she had for Clint months ago. "It suits you," she said. "You've come a long way." As Eddie sipped his coffee, the door to the diner opened and a man stepped in. He was younger than Eddie, with a hollow look in his eyes and clothes that had seen better days. The man glanced around nervously, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked, "Could someone spare a little help? Just enough for a meal?" The room fell silent, the scene eerily familiar. Eddie watched as the other patrons avoided eye contact, some turning back to their conversations, others glancing at the man with mild irritation. He didn't hesitate. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a $10 bill and waved the man over. "Hey," Eddie said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Sit down, coffee's on me." The man hesitated, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Really?" he asked, his voice cracking. Eddie nodded. "Yeah, really." The waitress brought over a menu, and the man looked at Eddie with gratitude that went beyond words. As the man ordered his food, Eddie leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to Clint. He could almost hear Clint's gruff voice again. "No one's gonna hand you anything." Eddie didn't just see himself in the man across from him. He saw the chance to be what Clint had been for him. The difference was clear. Clint had given Eddie an opportunity, and now it was Eddie's turn to do the same. Later that night, as Eddie walked home under the dim glow of streetlights, he passed the construction site. He paused, staring up at the skeletal frame of the building he had helped bring to life. It wasn't just a job site anymore. It was a testament to what could happen when someone believed in you, even if that belief came in the form of tough love. Far away, in his own quiet home, Clint Eastwood sat in his study, reading the day's paper. There was no mention of Eddie, no updates on his story, and Clint preferred it that way. He didn't need recognition or praise. For him, it was enough to know that he'd planted a seed and that Eddie had done the hard work of letting it grow. As Clint folded the paper and leaned back in his chair, a faint smile crossed his face. He didn't need to see the results to know that somewhere, Eddie was making the most of his second chance. And maybe, just maybe, he was passing it on to someone else. What would you have done? If this story made you think, don't stop here. Subscribe now for more powerful stories that challenge, inspire, and keep you coming back. Like, share, and turn on notifications. Don't miss what's next.